Welcome to the Northwest Mounted Police. This is a lesson some of you have been asking for a long time, and finally, your dreams have come true.
It's me, your old pal, Prospector Fred. This lesson ain't worth learning. Turn back if you got yourself any sense.
Oh, that Prospector Fred. He just shows up in the most inconvenient places. So, sorry, I'm a little distracted. There's some kid in my backyard standing on the edge of the fence. I hope he doesn't jump. But anyway, history of the Northwest Mounted Police. So, this was a time of lawlessness. Just like these kids jumping around on the fence in my backyard, they needed some kind of order. And so Johnny McDonald and his government founded the Northwest Mounted Police. There was that vast area called the Northwest Territories. Today it's spelled differently. There's no hyphen. It's just all one word, Northwest. And one of the particularly bad problems was illegal whiskey trading, especially these bootleggers coming up north from the United States. So some of the other jobs they did, they also helped to relocate the First Nations away from the railroad route. A lot of First Nations were not happy about the railroad going through their land, and they were stealing horses from the CPR. The Mounties helped to put a stop to this. As mentioned, they were stopping the whiskey trading, but not only that, a lot of communities, people were wanting to drink alcohol, and this was a real challenge trying to enforce what's called prohibition of alcohol. In the north, we talked about the gold rush. They helped to keep order. Things were pretty lawful there, especially compared to what was going on in Alaska. You might be wondering, how did they become royal, eventually the Royal Canadian Mounted Police? That was actually because some of them volunteered to fight along with other members of the British Empire in South Africa in the Second Boer War. And so they were just volunteers, and because of their contributions, the royal family said, "You're going to be royal too." They also worked pretty much as Canada's Secret Service during World War I. We didn't really have a spy agency or anything, and because most of the RCMP officers were of British descent, and they were wanting to spy on people who were particularly Germans or Ukrainians, they would recruit informants from those communities to spy on their own families. Pretty smooth. And in 1920, they would merge with the Dominion Police, who were more in eastern Canada, to become the RCMP. A lot of people weren't thrilled with the job they were doing, but the new provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they didn't want to set up their own provincial police forces like Ontario and Quebec had done. They said, let's just keep the RCMP, or the NWMP at the time. So the First Nations actually got along pretty well for the most part with the RCMP, especially the ones around Alberta. They saw what was happening in the United States. There were actually huge battles and massacres of First Nations down there, and they said, you know what, we'd rather be on the same side as the Northwest Mounted Police than being at war with them. The Inuit as well, they hadn't had much contact with the Europeans, but they were pretty good, pretty smooth with the RCMP, or the Northwest Mounted Police rather, because they pretty much let them get away. They let some things slide. They treated it more like you were a misbehaving child than a criminal who should be thrown in jail. But some of the First Nations, the non-Inuit ones up in the north, they had had interactions with Europeans before, and they hadn't always been so great. You can think of like the prospectors, for example, who really shredded up the land there. And so they were quite distrustful of the police. And they also tended to blame them for anything that went wrong. Update, those kids are still alive in my backyard. Okay, so Fort Macleod was named after Colonel Macleod, who was one of the commissioners of the NWMP. He was the second commissioner. It was actually built in southern Alberta to stop the illegal whiskey trade, and for the most part, it was successful. This is a colorized photo. Okay, my grandfather was actually born in Fort Macleod, on a personal note, but it's not all about me. Okay, so they had one of the early photographs we have here from 1878 is the NWMP hanging out with the Blackfoot outside of Fort Calgary. So not too far from where we are. So they had a pretty decent understanding and appreciation for the First Nations and getting along with them, respecting some of their cultural practices. But some of the hard work they were doing to follow government orders definitely did not endear them to the First Nations, such as moving them off their land for the sake of the railroad. Okay, so what was the legacy? What was the long-term impact of the NWMP? So, for the most part, you can say that they were successful. They were able to maintain, for the most part, peace with and among the First Nations. So there weren't any huge wars anymore between the First Nations. They didn't have to go ahead massacring them. And the gold rush was pretty orderly. That being said, there were their criticisms of the NWMP. And particularly it came to a head just after World War I. A lot of people were out of work coming back from the war, and there was a big strike in Winnipeg. Pretty much everyone was on strike. The NWMP felt they were losing control, and they actually did fire on the crowd, killing and injuring several people. And this was really criticized, and people thought they need some kind of unified leadership. And that's why they merged with the Dominion Police so we would have one solid force. But what can't be denied is that the Mountie is one of the top symbols of Canada when people think of Canadian stereotypes. Yep, we've got hockey, beavers, maple syrup, but right up there with all those others is the Mountie. And part of that is because of the red uniforms they had, very, very iconic and recognizable, but also because it's such a romantic idea of these well-dressed guys riding into the wilderness, maintaining law and order, both in Canada and the United States and Britain. They wrote a lot of novels about this. And one of the things as Canadians that we often sort of brag about with the Mounties is that they were a lot more disciplined and orderly than the rough and tough cowboys and sheriffs who were keeping the peace in the United States. And so just to draw attention, some of these paintings, a lot of them are by this artist Arnold Freiberg, who was actually an American artist, and he made over 200 paintings of Mounties. And as a result, he's the only American member of the RCMP. He was made an honorary member for really glamorizing their old way of life. Okay, and we see that also with the musical ride. So now these uniforms, as you've probably seen an RCMP officer before, around Chestermere or other places you may be, that these uniforms now, that used to be their regular ones, are now just ceremonial for fancy functions like the musical ride. Okay. Uh-oh.
There's no gold to be found in these here parts. I can still turn a tidy profit by kidnapping you, though. Don't do that. Just so you don't think of escaping, I'll turn you into a penguin with my prospector magic. Shaboom! I can't wait to eat this single fried egg and drink a hot pot of coffee. Wait, did I just hear the sound of a young woman being turned into a penguin? Duty calls. Duty calls. Stop. You're under arrest. Turn that young woman back into a human, or I'll be forced to shoot. This ain't right. I can't do much prospecting in jail. Don't worry, buckaroos. Your old pal, Prospector Fred, will find a way out of this one. I swear I will have my revenge.
Now that I'm feeling again, you can be confident. I don't need a prescription on you to see that you've run from me.
I'm sorry, but that would be unprofessional. Besides, there's a half-fried egg with my name on it. Some things in life are worth more than love. Goodbye forever.
So we saw just how romantic the life of the Mounties could be. Now, under normal circumstances, I would actually have us do a little bit of a simulation here, where we would take on the roles of Mounties trying to apprehend those whiskey bootleggers. And we would travel around different parts of the class by wagon, rail, or horse, exploring those difficulties that the Mounties faced, and see just how effective, working as a team, you would be able to maintain law and order. As such, though, we will not be doing that. We'll be moving on in our next lesson to be working on our written assignment. We'll be looking at a source analysis. So that's something very exciting that I hope you're looking out for. So, until we meet again, farewell.